The first thing I felt wasn't the blade of a knife or the barrel of a gun, but a thin, cold pressure against my throat that stopped me mid-stride in the absolute silence of the Blackwood Valley. I was moving fast because the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the pines, and I knew that once the light died in these woods, the temperature would drop faster than a stone in a well. My hands went up instinctively to my neck, and my fingers brushed against a line of high-tensile fishing wire, stretched perfectly taut between two ancient oaks, positioned at exactly the height of a man's windpipe. If I had been running, if I had been just a little more hurried to get back to my base camp, that wire would have done more than just stop me. It would have opened me up right there on the forest floor. I stood frozen for a long minute, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, while I looked around the darkening woods for any sign of the person who would set such a cruel and calculated trap. I am a professional land surveyor, which means I spend most of my life in places where people aren't supposed to be, mapping out boundaries that nobody cares about until there is a dispute. I'm used to the isolation, and I'm used to the strange things you find in the brush, but this was different because this wire was clean, brand new, and lacked even a speck of forest debris or pine needles. It had been placed here recently, perhaps even after I had passed through this very same clearing earlier that morning to set my transit levels. The realization made the hair on my arms stand up because it meant someone was not just living out here in the deep woods, but they were actively watching my movements and predicting my path back to safety. Why would someone want to stop a surveyor, a man with nothing but a vest full of stakes and a tripod, unless I had accidentally stepped onto something they were desperate to keep hidden from the map? The silence of the woods began to feel heavy and intentional, as if the birds and the insects were holding their breath along with me while the shadows stretched out into long, distorted fingers. I carefully stepped back from the wire, my eyes darting between the thickets of mountain laurel and the deep, light-swallowing hollows beneath the ferns. I needed to get to my truck, which was parked nearly 3 miles away at the trailhead, but the direct path was now a graveyard of potential traps that I couldn't see in the failing light. Every time a leaf skittered across the ground or a branch groaned under its own weight, I spun around with my survey lath held like a club, feeling the utter vulnerability of being alone in a place where the rules of civilization had been replaced by something much darker. I decided to veer off the marked trail, thinking that if I moved through the rougher terrain of the ridgeline, I might bypass whatever other surprises were waiting for me on the easy path. The climb was brutal, and as the last of the orange light faded into a bruised purple, I found myself crawling over moss-slicked boulders and through thorn bushes that tore at my clothes and skin. I kept my headlamp off for as long as I could, fearing that a beam of light would be nothing more than a neon sign pointing directly to my location for whoever was out there. But eventually, the darkness became total, a thick and suffocating veil that forced me to click the light on for just a second to check my compass. In that brief flicker of LED light, I saw it again. Another glimmer of silver reflected back at me just 10 feet ahead. Another wire, this one angled low across a narrow gap between two rocks. This wasn't a random trap for an animal, because no animal walks at the height of a human ankle or a human throat with such terrifying precision. I was being steered, funneled like livestock toward a specific destination, and the realization sent a cold shiver down my spine that felt like a bucket of ice water. I turned my light off immediately, but the image was burned into my retinas, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that I wasn't alone on that ridge. I heard the faint, rhythmic thud of a heavy boot hitting soft earth, not behind me, but somewhere off to my left, moving parallel to me with a steady and patient gait. This person wasn't rushing because they didn't have to. They knew the terrain, they knew where the wires were, and they knew that eventually the exhaustion or the fear would make me move too fast. I crouched low behind a granite slab, pressing my face into the cold stone and trying to regulate my breathing so it wouldn't betray my position in the stillness of the night. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the blood rushing through my ears and the distant, lonely hoot of an owl that sounded more like a mocking laugh. Then, a voice drifted through the trees, a low and gravelly rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used for years, whispering just loud enough for the wind to carry it. "You're off the line, surveyor. You need to stay on the line if you want to find your way home." The voice didn't sound angry or even particularly violent. It sounded like a teacher correcting a wayward student, which made it 1,000 times more terrifying than a scream. I didn't answer, I didn't move, and I certainly didn't go back to the line because I knew that the line was exactly where he wanted me to be. I remembered my topographic map, the one I had memorized over weeks of preparation, and I recalled a steep drainage pipe that ran under an old logging road about a half-mile to the east. It was a dangerous, crumbling descent down a 60-degree slope, but it was the only place where a man couldn't easily string a wire or wait in ambush without being seen from above. I began to crawl, not away from the voice, but toward the edge of the ravine, using the sound of the wind in the pines to mask the noise of my movement. My knees were bruised and my palms were bleeding, but the fear of that invisible wire or that calm, haunting voice kept me moving through the dirt like a hunted animal. I reached the edge of the slope and looked down into a black abyss that seemed to have no bottom, but I could hear the faint trickle of water at the base, which meant there was a way out. Just as I prepared to slide down, a beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the trees behind me, sweeping back and forth in a frantic search pattern. The man wasn't being patient anymore. He realized I had broken his pattern, and the heavy thud of his boots turned into a frantic, crashing run through the underbrush. I didn't hesitate. I tucked my chin and slid down the embankment, feeling the earth give way beneath me as I tumbled through dirt, rocks, and dead branches. I hit the bottom with a jarring thud that knocked the wind out of my lungs, but I didn't stop to check for broken bones because I could see the light from his flashlight dancing at the top of the ridge. I scrambled into the mouth of the concrete drainage pipe, which was slick with algae and smelled of stagnant water and rot, and I pushed myself as far into the darkness of the tube as I could fit. I lay there, shivering and gasping for air, as the light from above hit the floor of the ravine just outside my hiding spot. I saw his shadow first, a long and distorted shape of a man carrying something long and thin, like a pole or a rifle, as he paced back and forth at the entrance of the pipe. He knew I was in there. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, and I waited for the sound of a gunshot or the hiss of a flare being tossed inside. But instead, there was only silence, a long and agonizing minute of absolute stillness that felt like an eternity in the cold dark. "I'll keep your tools for you, surveyor. You won't be needing them where you're going." The footsteps eventually faded away, heading back toward the trailhead where my truck was parked, but I didn't move for hours. I stayed in that pipe until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the valley, and only then did I emerge, cold and broken, to find a different way out of the woods. I hiked 5 miles in the opposite direction to a ranger station, and when I finally got back to my truck with the police, it was still there, untouched except for one thing. Tied across my driver's side door was a single, shimmering strand of fishing line, and hanging from it was my own survey compass, smashed to pieces. I never went back to finish that job, and I never go into the woods anymore without looking at the space between the trees, always searching for the shimmer of a line that shouldn't be there. I knew the moment I turned the key and heard that hollow, rhythmic clicking instead of the roar of the engine that I was in the kind of trouble that most people only ever see in movies. The sun had already disappeared behind the jagged silhouette of the great North Woods, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and I was exactly 42 miles from the nearest paved road. I had been out here for 3 days on a solo fishing trip, enjoying the kind of silence that you can only find when you are deep enough in the timber that the birds stop singing when they hear you breathe. But now, that silence felt less like a luxury and more like a heavy shroud as I sat in the cab of my old truck, staring at the dashboard lights that were flickering and dying right before my eyes. I hopped out and popped the hood, expecting to see a loose battery terminal or perhaps a broken belt, but what I found in the beam of my flashlight made the blood turn to slush in my veins. The engine hadn't just failed. It had been surgically dismantled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and how to make sure I wasn't going anywhere. My spark plug wires hadn't just come loose. They had been sliced clean through with a sharp blade, and the distributor cap had been removed and tossed into the dark brush somewhere beyond the reach of my light. I stood there for a long time, the cold metal of the hood under my hand, as the reality of my situation began to sink in with a terrifying, slow-motion clarity. This wasn't a mechanical failure, and it wasn't the work of a curious animal. This was a deliberate act of sabotage by someone who was likely still out there in the shadows, watching me realize that I was trapped. I scanned the wall of pines that pressed in on the narrow logging trail, but the darkness was absolute, a thick and impenetrable wall that seemed to pulse with a hidden life. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the vastness of the forest. But the only response was the distant, lonely creak of a dead branch swaying in the wind. I didn't wait for a second answer because I knew that whoever had the nerve to cut my wires while I was sleeping in my tent just 50 yards away wasn't interested in a friendly conversation. I grabbed my survival pack from the passenger seat, my fingers fumbling with the buckles in my haste, and I made a split-second decision to abandon the truck and move into the thickest part of the woods. I knew that if I stayed on the road, I was an easy target, a silhouette against the gravel that anyone with a pair of binoculars could track from a mile away. I clicked off my flashlight, choosing to rely on the dim, silvery glow of the rising moon, and I stepped off the path into the tangle of ferns and rotting logs that made up the forest floor. Every step I took felt like I was breaking 1,000 glass bottles as the dry needles and twigs snapped under my boots, echoing through the stillness like gunshots. I kept moving for what felt like hours, my lungs burning from the thin, cold air and my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs that I was sure could be heard for miles. I stopped to catch my breath behind a massive, lightning-scarred oak tree, and that's when I heard it. The sound of another engine, a low and guttural growl that was moving slowly down the very road I had just abandoned. It wasn't a truck or a car, but the high-pitched whine of an ATV, an engine that was built for navigating the tight, off-road spaces where a normal vehicle would bottom out. The light from its headlamps cut through the trees like twin sabers, sweeping across the trunks and illuminating the forest in brief, terrifying flashes of white and gray. The rider wasn't in a hurry. They were moving at a walking pace, stopping every few hundred yards to let the engine idle while they scanned the brush with a handheld spotlight. I pressed my back against the rough bark of the oak, trying to make myself as small as possible, as the light washed over the other side of the tree, missing me by only a few inches. I realized then that I wasn't being hunted by a random drifter, but by someone who treated these woods like their own private laboratory, a person who knew every deer trail and every hiding spot between here and the border. I knew I couldn't outrun a machine on foot, especially not in the dark, so I had to find a way to make the terrain work against them before they circled back and found my tracks in the soft mud of the creek bed. I remembered passing a stagnant, black-water marsh about a mile to the west, a place where the ground turned into a treacherous slurry of peat and waist-deep silt that could swallow a man or a machine in seconds. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only place where the weight of an ATV would be a disadvantage instead of an asset. I began to move again, staying low to the ground and using the shadows of the ridgeline to mask my silhouette, while the sound of the ATV continued to drone in the distance like a persistent, angry insect. The smell of the marsh reached me before I saw it. A thick, sulfurous odor of decaying vegetation and standing water that told me I was close to the edge of the trap. I found a spot where the trail narrowed between two large boulders, leading directly into the heart of the mire, and I began to lay my own version of a lure. I took my bright orange rain poncho and draped it over a low-hanging branch just inside the tree line of the marsh, making sure it looked like someone was huddled there, trying to hide in the brush. Then, I waded into the freezing, foul-smelling water at the very edge of the swamp, sinking up to my knees in the muck as I pulled myself behind a cluster of high cattails. I waited, my teeth chattering so hard I had to bite down on my sleeve to keep them quiet, until the whine of the ATV grew louder and the flicker of the spotlight began to dance across the surface of the black water. The engine slowed as the rider spotted the orange fabric of my poncho, and I saw the silhouette of a man in a heavy canvas coat as he leaned forward, squinting into the gloom. He didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine, thinking he had finally cornered his prey, and the heavy tires of the ATV churned into the soft earth at the edge of the marsh. For a second, the machine held its ground, but as he pushed further toward the poncho, the front tires suddenly broke through the thin crust of peat and plunged into the deep, viscous silt below. The engine roared in a high-pitched scream as the rider tried to reverse, But the more he spun the tires, the deeper the machine sank, tilting precariously to one side until the engine sucked in a mouthful of swamp water and died with a final, wet cough. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the man cursing as he struggled to pull his legs free from the suction of the mud. I didn't wait to see if he could get out. I used the moment of his confusion to scramble out of the cattails and run as hard as I could back toward the logging road. I didn't care about the noise anymore, and I didn't care about the branches that whipped across my face, because I knew that for the first time that night, I had the advantage of distance. I ran for nearly 3 hours, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, until I finally saw the flickering lights of a fire lookout tower on the distant horizon. When I finally reached the ranger at the top of that tower, I was covered in mud and blood, but I was alive. They never found the man, only the abandoned ATV half-submerged in the black water of the marsh, with no identification and a toolkit in the rear compartment that contained nothing but a set of wire cutters and a collection of stolen distributor caps. I saw it just as I was about to zip up my sleeping bag for the night. A brilliant, searing arc of crimson light that tore through the canopy of the pines and illuminated the valley in a ghostly, flickering red. It was a distress flare, the universal scream for help in the wilderness, and it had been launched from the deep ravine near the Devil's Backbone, a place where the cliffs are sheer and the trails are nothing more than crumbling goat paths. My heart skipped a beat because I knew that in these temperatures, anyone injured enough to fire a flare wouldn't survive the night if the frost got to them before a medic did. I didn't think twice. I threw on my boots, grabbed my heavy-duty first aid kit, and sprinted out of my camp with my headlamp cutting a frantic path through the ancient, towering timber. I felt a surge of adrenaline, that misguided sense of heroism that blinds you to the small, inconsistent details that should have made me stop and turn back immediately. The woods at night are a completely different world than the one we walk during the day, as the shadows seem to shift and stretch with a life of their own, and the familiar landmarks of the trail become distorted and alien. As I drew closer to the site where the flare had originated, I noticed that the forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had sensed a predator and retreated into the deepest burrows they could find. I reached the edge of the ravine, my breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps that hung in the air like smoke, and I began to call out into the darkness, expecting to hear a moan of pain or a desperate shout for assistance. But there was nothing, only the sound of the wind whistling through the sharp rocks and the distant, rhythmic creak of a tree trunk rubbing against another in the gloom. I lowered my light to the ground, searching for footprints or signs of a fall, and that is when I saw him sitting perfectly still on a flat boulder at the very base of the cliff. He wasn't lying down, and he wasn't clutching a broken limb. He was just sitting there with his hands resting on his knees, watching me descend the slope with a calm, unblinking intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed my pace, the hero in me suddenly feeling very small and very exposed, as the beam of my light hit his face and revealed a man who looked entirely too composed for someone who had just fired a signal for a life-threatening emergency. He was wearing a clean, tactical-style jacket and heavy work boots, and right next to him on the rock sat a heavy-duty zip tie, already looped into a circle, and a roll of industrial-strength duct tape. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me like a physical blow. There was no accident, no injury, and no reason for that flare other than to pull a witness out of their secure camp and into this isolated, lightless hole in the earth. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound authoritative, while my eyes darted around the clearing to see if he was alone or if there were others waiting in the dark. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood up slowly, his movements fluid and practiced, and I noticed that he wasn't looking at my face, but at my hands, as if he were measuring how much of a fight I could put up. He took a step toward me, and in the harsh glare of my headlamp, I saw the empty flare gun tucked into his belt, its barrel still faintly smoking from the shot that had lured me here. I backed away, my boots sliding on the loose shale of the ravine floor, but the wall of the cliff was behind me, and the only way out was the steep, narrow path I had just used to come down. "I thought you were hurt." "I saw the flare," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through every self-defense tactic I had ever heard of, realizing with a jolt of panic that I had left my hunting knife back at my campsite. The man finally spoke, and his voice was a low, melodic hum that felt completely out of place in the middle of a dark forest, sounding almost like he was reciting a lullaby. He told me that he had been waiting for someone like me, someone with a good heart who wouldn't be able to ignore a cry for help, because people who care are always the easiest to predict. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object that glinted in the light, and I knew that if I let him get within arm's reach, I would never be seen again. I had my first aid kit in my left hand, a heavy, plastic-molded box filled with various medical supplies, and I realized it was the only weapon I had in that moment. As he lunged forward with a speed that defied his calm demeanor, I didn't run. I swung the kit with every ounce of strength I had, catching him square in the side of the head just as he reached for my throat. The impact made a sickening thud, and he stumbled back, his boots slipping on the very shale that had almost tripped me moments before. I didn't wait to see if he would get back up. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out a small, pressurized canister of bear mace that I always kept clipped to my belt, a tool I had almost forgotten in the sheer terror of the encounter. I didn't just give him a quick spray. I emptied the entire canister into the air between us, creating a thick, orange cloud of stinging chemicals that the wind whipped right into his face. The man let out a choked, gurgling scream as the mace hit his eyes and lungs, and he collapsed to his knees, clawing at the air as the world around him turned into a blur of fire and pain. I used that window of opportunity to scramble back up the path, my fingers digging into the dirt and rocks as I climbed with a desperate, animalistic energy I didn't know I possessed. I didn't stop at my camp. I didn't even grab my tent or my sleeping bag. I just ran through the woods toward the distant sound of the highway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I reached the road nearly 2 hours later, flagging down a passing semi-truck with my headlamp, and the driver could tell just by the look on my face that I had seen something terrible in the trees. When the police eventually searched the ravine the following morning, they found the rock, the duct tape, and the discarded flare gun. But the man was gone, leaving behind only a set of footprints that led deeper into the unexplored wilderness of the Devil's Backbone. They also found a collection of other items hidden in a nearby crevice. Several cell phones, a dozen different wallets, and a stack of driver's licenses from people who had gone missing in that forest over the last 5 years. I realized then that I wasn't the first person to see a flare in those woods, but I was the only one who had ever made it back to tell the story. Now, whenever I see a flash of red light in the night sky, I don't feel the urge to help. I feel the urge to run, because I know that sometimes a cry for help is just the sound of a trap being set. I have always preferred the parts of the woods where the trails stop being maintained and the forest begins to reclaim the earth, because there is a specific kind of prehistoric peace that you can only find when you are miles away from the nearest cell tower or paved road. I was on the 4th day of a solo trek through the northern reaches of the Cabinet Mountains, moving through a dense thicket of lodgepole pines that grew so close together they seemed to block out the very air. The ground was a soft, spongy carpet of moss and decaying needles that muffled my footsteps perfectly, which is perhaps why I didn't hear anything until the moment my boot caught on something that didn't feel like a natural root or a fallen branch. It was a sharp, metallic tug against my shin, followed immediately by a sound that made my heart stop dead in my chest. The clear, rhythmic clanging of a dozen small brass bells ringing out from the high branches of the trees above me. I froze instantly, my breath hitching in my throat as I looked up and saw a thin, almost invisible wire made of high-tensile fishing line zigzagging through the canopy, connected to a series of old-fashioned cowbells and metal scraps. This wasn't a trap designed to hurt or kill, but a perimeter alarm designed to announce the arrival of an intruder to whoever was living in the hollow just beyond the ridge. I stood there in the absolute silence that followed the ringing, feeling a cold, prickly sensation of being watched by eyes I couldn't see, and I realized with a jolt of panic that I had stumbled directly into someone's private, illegal sanctuary. In the deep woods, people who set perimeter wires aren't looking for hikers to share a meal with. They are usually protecting something they are willing to kill to keep hidden. I began to back away with agonizing slowness, trying to retracing my own footprints in the moss so as not to trigger another wire, but the forest was no longer silent. From the top of the ridge, I heard the low, urgent whistle of a man, followed by the heavy, crashing sound of someone moving through the brush with a sense of purpose and familiarity that I didn't possess. Then came the sound that truly terrified me. The deep, guttural baying of a large dog that had picked up my scent and was already closing the distance between the ridge and the wire. I didn't have time to be stealthy anymore, and I knew that if I stayed in this thicket, I would be cornered like an animal in a cage, so I turned and began to run in the opposite direction, my lungs burning as I forced my way through the grabbing branches of the pines. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor that made it impossible to see where the ground ended and the drops began. I could hear the dog getting closer, its barks turning into a steady, predatory rhythm that told me it was less than 100 yards away and gaining ground with every second. I knew I couldn't outrun a hound in its own backyard, and I knew that the man following it likely had a rifle and a much better understanding of these hills than I ever would. I reached a small, rocky stream that carved a path through the center of the valley, and I remembered an old trick I had read about regarding masking a scent, but I didn't have time to play games with water. I needed a way to turn the perimeter alarm against the person who built it. As I crossed the stream, I saw another wire. This one stretched low across the water, nearly hidden by the mist rising from the cold current. I didn't step over it. Instead, I grabbed a heavy, waterlogged branch from the bank and threw it with all my might further down the stream, deliberately snagging the wire and setting off another frantic chorus of bells. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the canyon, creating a confusing wall of noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I heard the man shout a command to the dog, and for a moment, the baying stopped as the animal became confused by the conflicting sounds of the alarms ringing in different directions. I used that brief window of hesitation to scramble up a steep, shale-covered embankment and hide myself inside a narrow crevice between two massive boulders that overlooked the stream. From my hiding spot, I watched as the man emerged from the trees, a tall, gaunt figure wearing a faded camouflage jacket and carrying a short-barreled shotgun that looked well-worn and dangerous. He was holding the dog by a thick leather collar, his head tilting as he listened to the bells I had just triggered further down the water. He looked frustrated, his eyes scanning the shadows with a paranoid intensity that made me press my body even tighter against the cold stone of the crevice. He whispered something to the dog and began to head toward the sound of the second alarm, moving away from my actual position and toward the trap I had inadvertently helped him set for himself. The minutes passed like hours as I sat in the darkness, listening to the fading sounds of the man and his dog moving deeper into the ravine, away from the only trail that led back to the main road. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I also knew that the forest was likely riddled with more wires, more bells, and perhaps things much more dangerous than a simple alarm. I took off my boots and tied the laces together, hanging them around my neck so I could move in my thick wool socks, allowing me to feel the ground with my feet and sense the tension of any wire before I actually tripped it. It was a slow, painful process that left my feet bruised and freezing, but it was the only way to navigate the minefield of the perimeter in the total darkness of the night. Every few yards, I would stop and reach out with a long stick, sweeping the air in front of me to catch the shimmer of the moonlight on the fishing line. I found 3 more wires that night, each one positioned at a different height, and each one leading back to a different part of the hidden camp I never wanted to see. I moved with the patience of a ghost, ignoring the cramps in my legs and the terrifying thought of the man realizing his mistake and doubling back to the stream. By the time I reached the high ridge that overlooked the logging road, the sky was beginning to turn a pale, sickly gray, and I could finally see the silhouette of my car parked nearly a mile away. I didn't put my boots back on until I was standing on the gravel of the road, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the laces. I drove away from that trailhead without looking back, and I didn't stop until I reached a town with a police station 2 hours away. When I told the sheriff about the wires and the bells, his face went pale, and he told me that I was lucky I hadn't made it past the second line, because the people living up in those sovereign camps didn't believe in warnings once you got close enough to see their faces. To this day, I can't stand the sound of wind chimes or the light tinkling of a bell. It takes me right back to that mossy forest floor, waiting for the tug on my leg and the sound of a dog that knows exactly what I taste like.